It's my honor to welcome you today, and it's my greater honor to introduce a panel of clearly the world experts on the topic that we're exploring today, and that's cybersecurity. There's not one of us that's not touched by these important issues that face us both technically and from a human factors perspective. I'm thrilled, and I'm not one given to use superlatives to introduce these two world experts with us today. Admiral Mike Rogers, the commander of U.S. Cyber Command, the director of the National Security Agency, and the chief of the Central Security Service. Would you join me in welcoming Admiral Rogers, please? And we're equally honored to have with us General Mike Hayden, who's currently the principal at the Chertoff Group and previously served as director of the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency. Would you join me in welcoming him as well, please? Now, the rules of engagement are very simple, and they are whatever Admiral Rogers and General Hayden want to do. We will first hear from Admiral Rogers, and then we'll hear from General Hayden. And after their prepared remarks, we will welcome your questions. You should have little cards on your chairs. We have people in the audience who will collect those and deliver them to me, and then we'll moderate the question panel. Admiral Rogers, thank you, sir, and over to you.
All right. So first and foremost, thank you all for taking time from busy lives to spend some time for my Air Force teammates. It's an honor to be with you all today. I've been a member of the Joint Force, so to speak. I was literally just thinking to myself, out of 36 years commissioned service, I'm at about 15 years of joint service right now. So I have spent a lot of time in this environment and had the opportunity to work with Air Force teammates as both Commander United States Cyber Command, where we have an Air Force component, as well as the Director of the National Security Agency, where we have 25th Air Force as the Service Cryptologic Element Commander for the Air Force. It's been an honor to work with my Air Force teammates, and I thank you for your willingness to spend some time. It's been great to watch Air Force in its cyber journey. This is a topic that General Goldfein and I spent a lot of time talking to each other about, as well as 24th Air Force about. So how, as a service, is the Air Force going to realize its vision about cyber, and how does cyber fit in the broader set of activities that the Air Force is engaged in to help this nation execute and the department execute its primary missions? I'm going to focus on the cybersecurity piece a little broadly and not be so service specific, although I welcome any questions you have. I will say it is great to see the internal dialogue and the ongoing evolution of cyber within the Air Force. I view that personally as a positive, because one of the things I try to tell leaders is we are on a journey, and where we are today in cyber is not where we're going to be 2 years from now. It's not where we're going to be 5 years from now. And so the idea that we're going to stick to a specific construct, a specific set of operational practices, or a specific set of skill sets over time, I think is very flawed. We have got to get used to the idea of change as a normal component of this mission set, and what are the implications of that change, from how you build with your human capital, how you build a mission team, what are the capabilities you need, how do you organize, whether that be formally from a command and control perspective all the way down to at the tactical seam, how do you organize to execute the mission. We've already seen significant changes in the evolution of cyber in the last few years. I've been the commander now for 3.5 years. It's amazing to see the journey. The real focus between General Hayden and I today is focusing on cybersecurity, and the kind of broad fundamentals I would highlight are, number one, it's about the ability to bring together multiple perspectives and multiple organizations to achieve the desired outcome. The idea that the DoD all by itself is just going to defend its networks, I don't think that's going to get us where we need to go. So we spent a lot of time thinking about what are the skill sets, what are the technologies, what are the capabilities that reside outside the department that we need to try to access or integrate into our scheme of maneuvers. We're trying to figure out how we defend the department. And I would urge us to think about defense more broadly. One of the things for Cyber Command, one of the goals that I've set for the coming year is, how do we migrate from a focus on the defense of networks, and how do we think more broadly about how we defend networks, combat systems, platforms, and data? To me, those are the four, when I look at, so what should we be focused on defending, those are the four things that I tend to focus on: networks, platforms, weapon systems, data. And so as we're trying to build the future for us from a joint perspective within the DoD, we are very focused on those 4 areas increasingly. We're also asking ourselves, so what do we need to evolve to? What does the future look like? Because as I said, it's not necessarily where we are today. And I'm very grateful. We got a department leadership that is very much telling us as commanders, as intelligence professionals, you've got to be open to the idea that the future is going to be different than the past. The underlying principles remain fairly consistent over time, but the way we go about achieving them, the way we organize to achieve them, that evolves over time. And with that, I very much look forward to your questions and look forward to what we're going to hear from General Hayden.
Thanks very much, Admiral Mike. And I'm really happy to be back among a bunch of familiar faces. This is really very nice. The Admiral mentioned that his writ goes beyond the Department of Defense. Specifically, he said the capacities on which he will have to rely to do his mission. All right, many of them are being created beyond DoD perimeters. Let me dwell on that as kind of the private sector guy for the moment on today's panel. Look, there are certain things only governments can do. And so let's make sure we fence some things over here that's only government activity. And Mike, if you look at his testimony, particularly the last year of the Obama administration, it hasn't been so much a focus so far during the Trump administration, but Mike has talked an awful lot about expanding his writ, or expanding our understanding of definition of reliance on willingness to use cyber deterrence rather than just defending at the perimeter wire. All right, and so I totally agree. There's some things only governments can do, and I agree with the Admiral. We need to explore some of those things further because a lot of his capacities right now are actually limited by policy and sometimes law that we might want to consider. Beyond that, though, let me also talk about how much in this domain we will be reliant on the private sector. And so I'm happy to talk to the Air Force Association, which is a government industry partnership, an activity that's got things like Cyber Patriot that's trying to raise the national water level of cybersecurity, not just narrowly defined military or Air Force. So let me work a little bit without a net, be a little bit provocative, a little forward-leaning. You know, when I went down to San Antonio and entered this universe for the first time about 20 years ago, my new team down there said, General, take out a clean sheet of paper and a number 2 pencil and write this down. Land, sea, air, space, cyber. It's a domain, it's an operational environment. We're going to go fight there. And now that's become accepted U.S. military doctrine, but it had its origins down in San Antonio with what was called then the Air Intelligence Agency. I naturally assumed, as a near 4-decade government guy, that defense up here in the cyber domain would look a lot like defense down here in physical space. In other words, it's all about the government providing us security, the way we look for the government to provide security in our airspace or on the ground or in our maritime borders and so on. Over time, I've come to realize that may not be true. In other words, the main effort down here was the government, and the private sector should tuck in behind the government in a support role. This audience knows this better than most I talk to. You know, you get that op order out of the Joint Chiefs, and there's a paragraph in there about command and control, and there's very clear guidance. You are the supported command, you are the supporting command. Or, you know, since we're near Civil War battlefields here, you can pull out an op order from Robert E. Lee and say, sir, your corps is the main body. And you gentlemen will conform your movements to the movements of the main body. And again, because of my habits down here, I thought in just about every case the main body for defense up here would be the government, and industry, private activity needs tuck in. I'm no longer convinced of that. I actually think in many day-to-day circumstances, the not first but only line of defense as a practical matter will be what we can achieve by and through our private sector. And therefore, I call on people broadly in government, not just the commander of Cyber Command, but broadly in government. So if you begin to realize that, accept that, what is it you need to do to empower or put another way, remove impediments in front of the private sector to be all they can be, to provide the kinds of defense that they may be the only ones who can do it up here. And again, working without a net, I'm going to use one very specific example. Recall San Bernardino? Recall the cell phone. Recall the steel cage death match between Tim Cook at Apple and Director Comey over at the FBI, with Director Comey legitimately needing to get into the phone for forensic, evidentiary, perhaps warning of future attacks that may be in that phone. It surprised a lot of people that Bill Lynn, Mike McConnell, Keith Alexander, Mike Chertoff, and Mike Hayden all shaded towards Apple. And we didn't do it out of civil liberties concerns. He was dead. He doesn't have any privacy rights anymore. We didn't do it for Apple commercial concerns. We did it on raw security grounds, that despite Jim Comey having a legitimate need for that information, one needs to think 2, 3, or 4 times before meeting that legitimate need. You make it harder for American industry to do what it was I just said to you, I think only American industry can do, which is to raise our overall cybersecurity level. Now, different circumstances, I may have voted a different way. All I wanted to do by introducing San Bernardino was to simply suggest in this domain, that public-private thing may actually be a bit on its head from time to time, and we need to be aware of that. Otherwise, we just won't be all we can be in keeping ourselves safe. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Sir?
Since you're up.
I'm up. Yes, sir, I'm up. And I am delighted that we are overwhelmed with a stack of questions that won't quit. And of course, I've reached the age where I cry at Walmart grand openings, but I'm getting dewy-eyed here just looking at them. The first question I'll direct to Admiral Rogers. Sir, what hasn't been mentioned here today, but is a very important topic, and that's infrastructure, the SCADA stuff, supervisory control and data acquisition, pipelines, power grids, water systems, the infrastructural issues that are associated with that. Do you think we have sufficient national policy to address that? And how do we bridge between government, between the military and the private sector and the public service sector to make sure that we treat those as urgently as we should?
So I think in some ways this goes to a point Mike made. I think one of the challenges of cyber is it is going to force us to get out of many of the traditional definitions that we have used to define responsibility, to define primacy, to define role. So if you look at, let's take power. If you look at critical infrastructure for us as a nation, from a DoD perspective, challenge number one, you got to acknowledge it is resident in the private sector. It's not resident in the government. Therefore, you're trying to ask yourself, so how do we apply government expertise in partnership with others to defend something which is not within the government's control or day-to-day knowledge in many ways? So, as General Hayden said, I think the challenge then becomes, what's the construct within that framework? What's the construct that generates the best outcomes? It isn't to me that, hey, I'm the DoD, I'm the 800-pound gorilla, I show up, okay, we understand command and control, we understand how to deploy capability, we understand how to rapidly surge to defend or to exercise or deal with problems. We got it now. That is not the way we're going to need to do this. So I think it's about a true partnership. The second point that I try to make is my military experience has led me to believe the probability of a successful mission outcome is not particularly high if the first time you're dealing with a problem or a set of partners is in the middle of a crisis. That is not the way to maximize the probability of a successful outcome. So as we're working at Cyber Command, as we're working with DHS, as we're working with the private sector, we've identified a couple ongoing, we've just started this within the last couple months, where I've argued, let's pick a couple test cases within the 16 currently defined sectors as critical infrastructure for the nation. Between that sector, a particular element within it, DHS and us, as to how are we going to actually execute this set of defensive responsibilities in the middle of a crisis, attack, or incident. I'm looking forward to see how that plays out, because what I hope comes from it is, how do we set up an ongoing, continual evolution that enables us to position ourselves for success in the day-to-day, as opposed to waiting to a crisis to respond? And I hope to see some results from that as we head into the next year.
Yeah, let me just add a point to reinforce, kind of back to my earlier theme about we've got to rethink, and Mike just mentioned that. So that might mean not that DOD or the government is a bit more generous with security clearances or a bit more rapid in sharing classified information. It may actually mean redefining what we mean by security clearances, redefining what we mean by classified information in this kind of world.
Thank you, sir. General Hayden, reflecting on your time as an Air Force leader, of course, the Air Force operates two legs of the nuclear triad, the air threat and the ICBM threat. We had a very energetic panel here yesterday regarding strategic modernization. I'd be interested in your, and then followed by Admiral Rogers, your thoughts on the implications of cyber warfare as related to the triad specifically. What are the considerations that we need to take on with respect to fielding modernized nuclear systems? And what are the implications to global threats with respect to cyber in a nuclear world?
Wow, there's a lot of unpacking to do in that question. So first of all, let me just really quickly address kind of a non-cyber answer that was the preface to the question, which was, we got to get back to our nuclear homework. And I spent easily a quarter century doing that, whether one warhead, 3 warheads, or 10 warheads in Wyoming was more or less stabilizing. Remember all that stuff we went through, and balance and mutually assured destruction? And 20 years ago I went, oh man, that's going to be interesting for the historians. And a bit surprisingly and sadly, it is back, largely because of the rearmament of the Russian Federation. And we're going to have to go back and reinvest, all right, and modernize, and pull out those old dust-covered tomes about nuclear theology, and begin to rethink again how we assure stability in a multipolar nuclear world. That's a sadness. We're going to have to go do it. But now it's made more complicated because you've got this added dimension of the cyber aspect. So very quickly, 2 things come to mind. One of the things we prided ourselves on in the nuclear world, in the nuclear era, was our positive control over our nuclear strike forces. That we knew when to launch, how to launch, and kept them completely under our control. They were totally reliable. They would respond to the order, and they would not respond to anything that was not the order. We spent the gross domestic product of a mid-sized country making sure that was always true. And now that's going to be more difficult to make true in a cyber world. So that would be one additional concern that didn't predate the current world. The other is what could, and here I might actually defer to Mike a little bit, because he has talked about deterrence, and we need to think our way more through cyber deterrence. I'm really interested in what he has to say. So what aspect of the cyber domain might actually contribute to the broader theory of deterrence, which back in the day we totally relied on our nuclear strike force to perform? I think there's an awful lot of thinking to be done about not just protecting our command and control, but how our offensive cyber capacity might actually contribute to what it was we formerly relied only on the physical destruction of our nuclear forces.
So as I look at it, it's a little bit like one of my opening comments. So when I look at the nuclear triad, I think to myself, how do we ensure that it has assured command and control? How do we ensure that the platforms and the capabilities are in fact safe and are ready to execute as directed by the National Command Authority? How do we make sure that the data associated with that evolution is non-corrupted, is accurate, and has not been accessed or manipulated in any way by anyone other than the intended recipients? So that same challenge where I've said, look, think beyond just the network piece. I look at the nuclear world and I think, you guys are a microcosm of this. We cannot just fixate on, well, it's just about the network or the C2 link. I think we've got to think much more deeply than that. And just as we have seen within the nuclear structure itself, we have come to to the conclusion, look, we have got to increase the level of investment, and we've got to upgrade the capability to reflect the challenges of today to assure and to continue to assure that this mission set is ready to deliver to the National Command Authority. There's a cyber component of this as well, and quite frankly, right now, we're working our way through that right now, as a matter of fact. It's something that General Hyten and I, the Stratcom commander, as well as my broader teammates within the DoD, we're spending a fair amount of time right now asking ourselves, so what are the cyber implications of this?
Thank you, sirs. This next question I'll first direct to you, Admiral Rogers, and there's an abundance of questions here regarding the interface between government, military, and the civilian sector. And I'll synthesize them into this one question. How do we define the boundaries of information sharing with respect to threats, with respect to threat remediation, with respect to actions that we can and can't take as a nation? The financial sector is understandably a little reluctant to share too much because of the effects on the financial markets of knowing that there are attacks that are happening. But could you share with us your insights, sir, on what's being done to share information on threats and to share information on remediating those threats?
So I think General Hayden made a very important point here. I think over time we're going to need to redefine, so what does classified information really mean? What does information sharing really mean? As I'm talking to the private sector about given DoD's mission to defend significant infrastructure, the 16 segments that I've identified as critical, against cyber incidents of significant consequence, how is the DoD going to execute that? And clearly the ability to share information in a timely way that's focused on generating mission outcomes is very important to the ability to execute that. One of the things I tell my private sector partners is what I need knowledge of is your network configuration, your network activity, and I need to get a sense for what are your critical paths, where's your most critical information, and if I can get access to that, I think we can work together and I can help with your challenge set. The flip side of that is I'm going, look, I don't need to watch or necessarily have access continually to your internal business processes and the data often associated with that. That's not what we need to execute our ability to defend. The other point I try to remind people is, so what does defend mean? My argument would be what the DoD and as an intelligence professional, what we bring to this defensive mission is expertise and knowledge of the potential actors and opponents, the way they operate, maneuver, and the skills that they bring and the tools they bring, combined with our knowledge of networks and schemes of maneuver within networks. That's what we're going to bring to the table to try to assist. But the flip side is, I don't have detailed knowledge of the particular network configuration. Again, it's one reason why I'm arguing we need to practice, work together on a continual basis. Gaining knowledge of an opponent while you're moving to contact against that opponent is a terrible way to learn. It generally leads to higher casualties, greater cost, greater probability of mission failure, at least longer to do the mission. I'm not interested in doing, discovery learning while you're moving to contact against an opponent if I can avoid it. So when it comes to information sharing, I'm always interested in what can we do working together, what insights can we provide each other, because that's another point I would make. You can't think about information sharing as just, it's just the government providing insights. It's got to work both ways, because quite frankly, the private sector has data and insight that without access to, we're sub-optimized, to defend the nation. I want to take advantage of the data analytics. I want to take advantage of the computational capability. I want to take advantage of the kind of capabilities that we can bring that are a real plus to a network we're trying to defend.
If I could add just something from the backside of this, because Mike said we need stuff from these guys, all right? What of our current regulatory environment, be it about competition or antitrust, environmental regulations and so on, all put out there for absolute legitimate reasons, have the inadvertent effect of slowing down cyber cooperation within a private sector sphere, within the financial services community. And so back to my earlier point, one of the things we might want to do is, in what ways do our old approaches get in the way of the private sector doing the kinds of things that we really want them to be able to do up here in this domain?
Can I do one other point? Sony is very instructive to me as a real world example. So in November 2014, it's hard to believe we're coming up on 3 years, when Sony is penetrated by the North Koreans, both for the extraction of intellectual property in the form of films, for the extraction of information in the form of company emails and company insights, as well as then the launching of 2 destructive Viper malwares that end up destroying laptops and portable devices associated with Sony. When Sony reached out to the federal government and said, clearly we've been hacked, we got an offensive act, and we're interested in government insight to help us understand what has happened, how do we make sure it doesn't happen again, and quite frankly, how do we drive them out of the network? You know, the first discussion from my perspective was the only way this is going to work is if we are open with each other. If we can't do that, this is a waste of capability. We're not going to be able to help you with the insights you need. To their credit, it's one of the best relationships I ever saw. I mean, talking to the general counsel, talking to the CEO, largely, not necessarily me personally, with the immediate feedback, we will give you access to whatever you need. What we ask is you're very upfront with us about what access do you require, why do you require it, and how do you intend to use the data. After a very quick discussion, it was let's roll up our sleeves and let's go. I just love that. It was one of the best real world examples I've seen with the private sector, where we were able to very quickly then determine who was the actor, how did they gain access, how did they maneuver within the network, what did they do to the network, how could we make sure that we could help Sony have confidence that they were no longer in the network. And we were able to achieve those outcomes in part because of this willingness to flow data back and forth between us.
Thanks, sir. General Hayden, I'll direct this first at you. Of course, Title 10 charges the services with organizing, training, and equipping. One of the portions of that equipping cycle is, of course, the acquisition process. Do either of you gentlemen have a perspective on, do we need fundamental changes in the way that we organize, train, and equip and acquire as part of that to reflect the dynamism of cyber systems and how quickly they change?
Yes.
Yes.
Now let me ask a follow-on question. What would you recommend as changes, and what specific areas in the acquisition process would you consider those most ripe for improvement?
I'll go first, but Mike's got the current answer, and he should give the lengthier, more definitive response. We may, let me again work without a net here, all right? As Cyber Command goes forward, and now it's a full unified command. I think one day, maybe soon, maybe not, it becomes a separate from NSA. I think one thing that would be really interesting to explore would be MFP 12, all right? So that we treat Cyber Command because of the character, the nature of its mission, the way we experimented with SOCOM, and with tremendous effect and success, because we gave the combatant commander some acquisition authorities that combatant commanders have never had before. So again, Mike's current, he knows more realities than I do about the current atmosphere, but as a concept, I really would consider a fully mature Cyber Command having acquisition authorities that jump over the train, organize, and equip function of the traditional military departments because of the speed thing.
So to go to the acquisition piece, the way we're currently structured, the way I say it is, number one, we've got to fundamentally change this construct. I'm not an acquisition professional. But the way I phrase it to people is, if you look at the criterion for success for most acquisitions, it is, did you deliver on time, at cost, and did you meet the operational parameters as specified in the proposal, so to speak? The criteria that I don't see, and that I often say is, so if you want to change culture, in my experience, and you want to change bureaucracy, you incentivize the behaviors and reward the behaviors that generate the outcomes you want, and you de-incentivize and penalize the behaviors that generate outcomes that are not consistent with what you're trying to achieve. So we need to change culture. Cybersecurity needs to be a fundamental aspect of how do we define success from an acquisition perspective. It's not necessary now. Secondly, I have also tried to argue because of the changing nature of the cyber dynamic, the idea that you are going to deliver a product, capability, or platform at a particular point in time and then slap your hands and say, cyber-wise, you're good to go, that's not going to work. So one of the things I talk about is, do we need to change the life cycle approach to the development and fielding of capability in the department from a cyber perspective, given the rate of change in this environment? And right now, the acquisition world isn't really set up to do that. It's not a complaint, it's an observation. It hasn't had to really work in that world to the same extent. And so to me, we've got to change that. And then the other thing for me as a commander is, and it goes a little bit about what Mike just said, we historically, when I say historically, have structured an acquisition process that was at its heart really designed to generate capital-intensive capability that took extended periods of time with great complexity, and therefore you built that into the process. While I acknowledge that some of the cyber capabilities we need have complexity, they are not necessarily capitally intensive in the same way. They don't require the same length of duration to generate. And so another part, and you've seen this with MF-11 and what SOCOM has been able to do in the Special Forces arena, you know, how do you over time generate that kind of capability for the department? And you've already seen where Congress within the last 18 months on a kind of test basis has granted Cyber Command initial acquisition authority, an initial set of funding, as a matter of fact, to kind of flesh and test this concept out. So as a commander, I'm really interested for us as to how we flesh this out over time.
We had a bit of a kind of a paleo example of this when I was director. If I read the trade press right, I think NSA has just extended the contract for what was known as the Groundbreaker program when I was director. I mean, in order to focus on mission, we outsourced all of our own IT, okay? All the workstations, all the phones, all the networks connecting them, including the classified networks, we just gave to the private sector because we could not manage their modernization within government procurement cycles. All right, so again, that's kind of a baby step. It's our IT, it's not their IT that we're trying to attack. But that has been successful enough that it's been extended.
And gentlemen, General Hayden, you mentioned Cybercom's elevation to a full unified command status. One of our attendees would be interested in your perspectives on, both of you gentlemen, on what's good about that and maybe what concerns you about that change for Cybercom. So General Hayden, if you'd care to lead on this one.
Yeah, sure. Very briefly, because this audience knows this part of the Bible here, all right? When I got that first briefing in Texas, land, sea, airspace, cyber, it's a domain, General. Welcome aboard. All right? That set in motion a train of inescapable logic that we would organize to fight in that domain with a separate command. Once you accept the fact that it is a domain, there is no one who's ever been an American GI would doubt sooner or later you're going to end up with Cyber Command. Now, I got, again, the first version of it with the unwieldy name of Joint Functional Component Command Net Warfare. And in late 04, early 05, with Jim Cartwright at Stratcom, I got direct line Title 10 authority to Mike Hayden at Fort Meade, where Mike Hayden could then use the resources that were already there under Title 50 funding to actually do Title 10 break things kind of things, rather than just spy on things kind of things. And then that is just a natural evolution. And so to answer your question very straightforward, that this is an absolute inevitability. It's to me, the easy step was the elevation. The little more controversial, but I still think necessary step is the breaking of the linkage between the person of the commander and the person of the director. The way I would put it is the current structure is overburdening for one organization, and the training wheels are getting in the way of the other organization getting up to actual speed. But here's the guy who's living it. I'll let Mike comment.
So the current structure today reflects the fact, number one, we acknowledge it was a domain, therefore we felt as a department you need a very traditional warfighting construct for how you're going to execute outcomes in this domain. Thus was born the idea of Cyber Command. At the same time, 7 years ago, when we stood it up, we also said, let's take advantage of the investments, expertise, and capacity that already are resident within the DoD. And when we asked ourselves, where is that center of DoD gravity in cyber 7 years ago, the answer was the National Security Agency out at Fort Meade, which is a combat support agency. Although it's an intelligence organization, it is a combat support agency that works for the Secretary of Defense. We spent the last 7 years in this construct now of, so how do you operationalize cyber outcomes within a very traditional warfighting structure at the same time that takes advantages of expertise, investments, capacity, and capability? And we're now at the stage where we're asking ourselves, are the assumptions and the environment that drove this construct 7 years ago, are they still in place today? So I don't want to get ahead of the leadership, as this is an ongoing topic. In fact, if you read the President's memorandum on the 15th of August, go to the White House site, it's online, in which he directed Cyber Command would be elevated to a combatant commander. He also said to the Secretary of Defense, I'm looking for your recommendation as to what the future alignment between these organizations should be. And if you recommend that the current alignment be changed, what would your plan be to do so? And so as a department, we're working our way through that right now. That's an ongoing process. So I would just say, let us go through that process. But to me, it also goes to one of my previous comments. We have got to be open to the idea that we are continually evolving in this construct. And look how fast it's gone in literally just over 10 years. We went from a functional component aligned against a COCOM to alignment with Title 50 authority and capacity, to also then saying, well, let's use a very traditional warfighting construct in the form of a sub-unified, to now, let's go to a combatant commander. And I think that the next question in this evolution is, does that alignment still make sense as we've evolved a very traditional operational function? I just think that the rate of change, I tell people, in the life of the DoD, you just take a look at the last 10, 12 years in this mission set, and, like Mike, I'm at my 36th year of commissioned service. I am blown away by the rate of change, particularly against traditional bureaucratic.
I'm going to double down on what Mike just said. So I started with JFCC-NW, right? Joint Functional Component Command Net Warfare, Title 10, worked for Stratcom, used NSA resources. There's stuff in front of that. There's stuff that predates that. Something Ken Minahan launched called the IOTC, the Information Operations Technology Center, which fundamentally was an underground, secret effort to develop cyber weapons under the rubric of an espionage agency out at Fort Meade. I mean, it was literally sleight of hand, because Ken Minahan saw that, to get into theology very briefly, if you can exploit another's network, you've already done the operational and technological heavy lifting, all right? The actual attack is a subset of the reconnaissance up here in the cyber domain. So Ken recognized people are going to be coming to our door about this sooner or later, and he wanted this small group. There's only about a couple hundred people. I inherited it, and I'm the one who turned the IOTC into Joint Functional Component Command Net Warfare. But there were people, visionaries like Ken Minahan, who saw this coming. Now the punchline is that is a total of 20 years ago. And in terms of the glacial pace of many things within the Department of Defense, that's amazing.
Thank you, sirs. Another one of our attendees, and I'll direct this again first to Admiral Rogers, the theme of this conference is breaking barriers. I'd be interested in both of your brief perspectives on what's nirvana, if there is one, with respect to cybersecurity and a national cyber posture. When will we know that we've arrived? And what are the barriers between where we are now and where we want to be? And how should we overcome them? Admiral Rogers.
So I always wonder, how do you define arrived? I just tell our workforce, given the rate of change here, you just got to get used to the idea that the goal line keeps evolving, keeps changing. And arrival, so to speak, isn't, to me, no criticism of anybody, but I try to remind the workforce, I don't think that's the mindset we really want to have. we got to acknowledge that that goal line for us keeps evolving, keeps changing. What do we got to do to keep getting as close to it as we possibly can? I'll let you go because I want to think. There was something that flashed in my mind.
I'll just add, in this domain, in both the espionage aspect and the warfighting aspect, all advantage is transient. And frankly, because it's not capital investment that you described, which is the key to power down here, the advantage is even more transient in this domain. So I'll double down on Mike. The goal lines keep moving.
Gentlemen, on behalf of the entire Air Force Association, I can't think of a better group of experts to have been brought together than you two. We genuinely appreciate you.
You're setting your standards very low.
No, sir, we are not. No, sir, we are not. And as we celebrate the 70th birthday of our United States Air Force, I'm pleased to present you each with a 70th anniversary birthday coin of our Air Force. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Admiral Rogers and General Hayden.